Hi, my name is Goldsmith. I'm the head of sales at Roanoke Insurance Group. We are specialists in all things logistics, insurance, and surety. And today we're going to talk about cross-border trade between the U.S. and Canada. I have my colleague, Glenn Patton, on the call. Say hello, Glenn.
Hello, Grant. Thanks for having me.
Glenn, I know we've talked about it a lot recently and at trade shows, of course, recently. But of course, everybody in the United States really wants to know what's going on with CARM and what updates you have for us. And further, really, what companies in the United States should be doing now in order to be ready when CARM is finally fully implemented.
Yeah, sure, Grant. Thanks for asking that question. I'm happy to talk about that. CARM is something that is being discussed heavily on both sides of the border, both in the U.S. and in Canada. And as we mentioned on our panel at the NCBFAA, we didn't know what was going to happen. Things were changing so rapidly. At that time, CARM was supposed to go into effect on May 13th. And unfortunately, as we all heard a few weeks ago, that CARM got delayed further until October of this year. CARM is something that has been talked about for years. It stands for the CBSA Assessment and Revenue Management Initiative. It has to do with accounting for the accruals of duties and taxes, an automated system that importers and customs brokers can use. And part of that it involved a financial security requirement. So they call it a release prior to payment, a little different than the U.S., where you have a U.S. import bond to cover duties and taxes. The CARM itself, the portal itself is collecting, accounting for the duties and taxes. And so they imposed a financial security requirement for importers to participate in the release prior to payment program. And that's what the bond is basically, when we talk about bonds in Canada, that's what it's doing. So it's one of the approved financial security instruments that CBSA is allowing for importers to have. The other is they can post a 100% cash deposit if they want. But we all know most people are going to go with bonds. It's an easier way and a less expensive way for importers to be able to post that financial security. So, the delay, it had to do with a lot of different things. So we'll see what happens in October. But at the end of the day, it's going to happen. I don't see CARM never not happening. And so we think it's important right now what folks should be, whether you're an importer in Canada or an importer in the U.S., is to be having conversations with your customs broker. And likewise, customs brokers should be speaking with their importers and talking about what they're going to be doing, how much they're going to be importing into Canada. If they're a non-resident importer, or do they need to be registered if they're not already registered? What does that look like? Customs brokers in the U.S. either have offices in Canada and or have partners in Canada. Same with folks, in Canada, they may have offices in the U.S. as well. So they have the resources. They can reach out to us. We can assist and help as best as we can. Obviously, as a surety specialist, our experience, our expertise is going to be more so on the financial security side. But I would say people should have those conversations now. It's going to be October before we know it, and it can be a bit of a process if somebody's not registered right now in Canada. Where they don't have a business number because they have to obtain that first before they can even start importing into Canada. So engage in those conversations immediately. It's something that I can't stress enough. You don't want to wait to the last minute. You wait to the last minute and who knows what's going to happen. And it could disrupt your business, and that's not something anybody wants to see.
Great. Yeah, no, so important. And I mean, along those lines, Roanoke, we've been doing business in the United States, so many years. I think, the U.S. clients really want to know, what are the differences between how we do business normally in the United States and then, how business is normally done in Canada. I know you've told me there's, differences between, the way the insurance works and how various, logistics entities, are viewed. Like, what advice would you give to, U.S. companies that are doing business in Canada now or that are thinking about doing business in Canada?
Yeah, great question, Grant. Being the one of the largest trade partners, Canada and the U.S., and also dealing with the USMCA, which allowed for a lot of that trade to continue, as well as partners down in Mexico. There's a lot of trade in North America going on. Stuff comes into Canada from Mexico, crosses through the U.S. So most U.S. companies will have partners in Canada or are starting to look at opening operations in Canada Likewise, Canadian companies are looking to partner with folks in the US and or looking to open up US offices. We're talking two different countries, so everything changes when it comes to regulations. So it's important that anybody thinking about setting up operations or doing cross-border trade, that they are engaging in conversations, not just with us as an insurance intermediary, but also transportation attorneys, because the laws are different. One law may apply on a shipment that crosses border, or you can have two laws that apply. It really depends on the situation. What I mean by that is, something going from the U.S. into Canada. Canada has different limitations of liability when it comes to truck freight. Likewise, U.S. has CARMAC. So Canada's at $2 a pound. CARMAC is full value of the cargo, unless you limit your liability. So what applies when? That's always the big question. Most people try to say if it's going northbound, then CARMAC is going to apply, even when it's in Canada. However, if I'm a smart claims person and I knew the damage occurred in Canada, I'd probably want to try and limit my liability to $2 a pound. So it gets into those situations, and also coming southbound, right? Some people say if it's southbound, it's $2 a pound. Well, we all know, Grant, you and I have been doing this for a long time, and courts interpret things the way they want to interpret things. And so if you have a situation in which something crosses the border from Windsor into Detroit and then is going into Chicago, technically you're crossing state lines, which is interstate commerce, and it's supposed to be subject to CARMAC. So a judge could turn around and say, sorry, your $2 a pound, even though it was coming from Canada, doesn't apply. You're going to be subject to CARMAC. And that brings up other issues as well, with respect to Canadian entities moving southbound and making sure that they have proper authority with the various U.S. Agencies, such as the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, because they want to be protected, right? There is no agency in Canada, as far as when we're talking about, we call freight brokers or property brokers in the U.S. There's nothing in Canada that is regulating that. Two provinces actually have something that address it similarly. Montreal says you've got to be registered. If you have an office in Montreal, you have to register with that province as a freight broker. Ontario actually says you've got to maintain a trust account to keep transactional records of the freight charges coming in and out to pay truckers. Think of it, Grant, similar to that BMC 84 bond that the U.S. requires for property brokers. There's no bond. There's nothing that says you have no liability, right? Everything's dictated by terms and conditions up in Canada. So it gets a little tricky and really can become an issue if you don't have the right terms and conditions or you haven't spoken to your attorney about that.
I do want to talk more about terms and conditions, because I know it's come up in conversations so many times at trade shows we've been at and with clients. But before I get to terms and conditions, what would you tell Canadian based clients about the business they do in the United States and the things that they need to be thinking about that apply in the United States and again don't apply in Canada?
The first thing I always say to Canadian companies, if you're moving freight southbound, have you registered with the FMCSA? And what authority are you looking to do? Are you trying to be a freight broker where you don't want to assume liability? We all know that the definition of a property broker in the U.S. clearly states they have no liability, but Canada, that there is nothing that literally says that, so that has to be in their terms and conditions. So we have to talk to them and educate them on understanding the differences between what the U.S. law is and what Canada may be, as losses may occur, and what limitations of liability you have or don't have. So we urge them to first get registered, right? We want to make sure that they are operating properly. Unfortunately, I see quite a few times up here where somebody says they're a freight broker, and they're issuing a bill of lading. The intent of that is to give it to the shipper, put the carrier's name on it, and the carrier may or may not move under that bill of lading. The problem is, if that carrier moves under that bill of lading and something's going southbound, I've personally seen situations where a judge interpreted it, hey, your name's on this bill of lading. Yeah, it says the carrier name, but your company name, ABC Freight Brokerage, is on that bill of lading. You know, it's the saying, if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck and walks like a duck, they're going to call it a duck. So we've seen where if somebody is trying to be a property broker, a freight broker, and issuing a bill of lading, and they're not registered as a freight forwarder with the FMCSA, it can become problematic. So we strongly urge Canadian companies wishing to go southbound to coordinate with their transportation attorneys and also with us to make sure that A, we're given the right coverages, and B, we're not missing anything that is a potential exposure to them that could potentially put their company out of business simply because they didn't do something that is pretty much simple to do, getting registered with the FMCSA.
Yeah, very good points. And we talk about terms and conditions all the time and how they can, well written terms and conditions can really help you and simplify things by, clarifying, roles and liability, and how, the lack of good terms and conditions can really, muddy the water and, leave you exposed to, a lot more liability than you intended to, ever accept. So, what advice do you have for people that are either in the United States doing business in Canada, or vice versa, with respects to terms and conditions, since it looks like there's literally, two different legal regimes, potentially involved in a claim?
Terms and conditions are a tricky one. You have to make sure that the terms and conditions can apply to both when freight is moving in Canada and freight is moving in the U.S. You know, a good terms and conditions I've seen where it's actually one I've seen from a U.S. company where they have all their U.S. terms and conditions when they're acting as a freight forwarder, acting as a property broker. Says, as a broker, we're not liable. As a freight forwarder, our liability is limited to 50 cents a pound. But then they have a Canada section. When we're operating freight in Canada, our limitation of liability is $2 a pound. So having terms and conditions like that would address both sides to protect themselves is very, very important. Likewise, equally important if you are a freight broker on both sides of the border, whether you're US or Canada, is making sure that your broker carrier agreements that you have with the motor carriers are specifically addressing both US and Canada as well. Because we'll find that if something's coming southbound, the trucker is going to really try to hold true to that $2 a pound. But is that fair that if they're moving interstate and they're registered as a motor carrier with the FMCSA, should they only be liable for $2 a pound? I'm not an attorney, but that's up to the courts to decide. But the broker carrier agreement should address that as well. Kind of going off on broker carrier agreements as well, we all know about the nuclear verdicts, Grant, going on in the U.S., how they've exploded over the last 10 plus years, and the amounts of the verdicts that certain courts around the U.S. are giving, the juries are awarding the plaintiffs. We don't have that in Canada. Canada, there are limitations of liability on bodily injury, and it all depends on the extent of the injury and how long it'll last. But we haven't experienced these massive nuclear verdicts that you see in the States. So it's a bit of a shock to some Canadian companies when they are trying to get insurance to cover auto, contingent auto liability in the U.S., and they go, "Whoa, why is it so much?" Well, it's the state of the market in the U.S. Those broker carrier agreements should also address to the motor carrier, "Hey, what do you have for auto liability?" A good broker carrier agreement is going to help get them out of certain claims.
Right. I mean, you just touched on insurance, so I mean, let's just, for the people on this call, I mean, the insurance is, again, the safety net behind all these, potential losses that we can see when we're, engaged in interstate commerce or international commerce. Uh, what do you feel is the most important thing from an insurance standpoint to know as you're between the USA and Canada? I mean, obviously there's different requirements, different insurance regimes. I know you and I talk about this all the time. What insurance terms would apply if the claim is in Canada? What insurance terms would apply if the claims are in the United States? I mean, how important is it to have someone that can coordinate and understand both those requirements for people doing cross-border business?
Yeah, Grant, it's extremely important. I mean, you and I talk extensively about this issue itself, right? Because some people, folks in the U.S., they have their policies, their cargo liability, their E&O, and they go, okay, well, I'm going to start moving freight into Canada. Well, somebody calls them up and says, oh, well, I'm moving something, from Calgary, Alberta to Toronto, Ontario. Whoa, time out. Those are things that need to be looked at because the insurance itself may not cover such things. So you can't just assume your policy is going to cover cross-border automatically. And again, if your underwriter doesn't know I'm going into Canada, or more importantly, the underwriter in Canada doesn't know I'm going into the U.S. and could be subject to CARM, those are things that need to be addressed. So it is extremely important to talk to a broker that understands both sides of the border, that knows what's going on in the U.S. and knows what's going on in Canada, and has the ability to, there are companies out there that can do policies that cover both sides, but then there's companies that won't cover U.S. operations. Likewise, there's U.S. companies that won't cover Canada operations. Some Canada policies require local placement depending on the coverage line. So there's all these nuances that have to be looked at, and ensuring that the coverages you have are in fact going to cover both sides. And that starts with talking to the broker and explaining to the broker, here's what I'm doing. A good broker asks a million questions. I know that frustrates people at times, but we're asking these questions for a reason, Grant. You know that we want to dig into the weeds here and find out exactly what's going on.
Glenn, I know you worked with Roanoke Insurance Group in the United States for many, many years, and then made the decision to go up to Canada and start our operations there and live there full time. It's just been so important, I think, to our ability to understand Canadian regulations and the status of the Canadian insurance market and surety market, and it's really just enabled us to help our U.S. customers better understand Canada.
We have so many customers on all segments of the business, whether they're a freight forwarder, a freight broker, or customs broker. Many of them have offices in Canada and or looking to open offices in Canada. Likewise, the Canadian, like I said before, Canadian companies are looking to open offices in the U.S. And to me, there was no better time to really explore that.